welcome, very warm welcome on this sultry evening here in South London to the third in our series of talks on celebrating Newman, John Henry Newman. So a bit of a preamble and then I'll introduce tonight's speaker. So in 1991, Newman was proclaimed venerable by the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, which is the first stage of the canonisation process. He was beatified on the 19th of September 2010 at an open-air mass celebrated by Pope Benedict XVI in Birmingham, which I know a number of people in this room have attended at the time, during what was the first papal state visit to the UK. In November 2018, the Vatican approved a second miracle involving the unexplained healing of a pregnant American woman from a life-threatening diagnosis, which was investigated by the Archdiocese of Chicago. On the 13th of February 2019, it was announced that Pope Francis had approved the decree concerning this miracle, and Newman's canonisation has now been confirmed as to take place on the 13th of October of this year. So, in honour of Newman, we're exploring the legacy of England's most famous convert, the first saint for 300 years, so I'm reliably informed, and his ongoing importance to living, teaching and passing on the faith. As I said, tonight is the third of a series of 4 talks, and it's a pleasure and privilege for me to introduce tonight's speaker. Father Guy Nicholls was born in Wolverhampton in 1955 and went to both Oxford and Cambridge and holds an STL from the Gregorian University in Rome. He's a priest of the Birmingham Oratory. Father, correct me if I get any of this wrong. And he's a lecturer in liturgy, patristics and sacramentology at Oscott College, which is the Birmingham Diocesan Seminary. He shares a passion for music with Newman. Apparently Newman's favourite musician was Beethoven, and he was an accomplished violinist. Father Guy shares this passion and is the founder and director of the John Henry Newman Institute of Liturgical Music. His current projects include the production and publication of the Graduale Parvum, consisting of simple Gregorian chants of the propers of the Roman Missal. He's co-authored a volume on Cardinal Newman as an educator, and he's contributed articles to many journals on a wide variety of liturgical topics. He's presently preparing for publication a book on Cardinal Newman's aesthetics, that is Newman's idea of beauty, which will be released later on this summer and will be entitled Unearthly Beauty. So here to talk about Newman and conscience, Father Guy Nicholls.
Surely inevitable that on mentioning Newman in connection with conscience, his words in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk must spring to mind. Certainly, if I'm obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toasts, which indeed does not seem quite the thing, I shall drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. As I say, everybody must be familiar with these words, and many people think they are the only significant thing that Newman had to say about conscience. Yet they are but a very small part of all that Newman has to say on this subject. And I propose to build up for you a rounded picture of Newman's understanding of conscience. What it is, how it is formed, what authority it holds, how it interacts with our own mind and with the magisterium of the Church. Good. Certainly, it's worth saying at the outset that in the view of the recent announcement that the Cardinal is to be canonised this coming October, his words may now seem to bear an even greater weight as one whose sanctity is recognised by the Church. But that fact alone does not necessarily imply any greater degree of doctrinal authoritativeness than was the case just a few days ago. We must also bear in mind that, as in many instances of Newman's treatment of specific subjects, so with conscience, he doesn't deal with it in a systematic way in any one place. Since he often discusses certain concepts in quite varied contexts, this may even lead at first sight to his seeming to hold diverse and even inconsistent views. Newman deals in detail with questions relating to the notion and working of conscience, especially at 3 stages of his career. First, in several of the Oxford University sermons, principally of the 1830s and 40s, in which he explores the role of conscience in protecting faith and guiding reason. Secondly, in the Grammar of Assent, on which he worked mainly in the 1860s, in which he deals with the fact and phenomena of conscience as evidence of God's existence and authority. And thirdly, in the already mentioned letter to the Duke of Norfolk of 1874, in which he explores the authority of conscience in relation to that of the Church's magisterium. Now, although this treatment of these issues is thus spread out over time, it may not really be helpful to deal with his doctrine in chronological order of writing. In the university sermons, for instance, Newman takes for granted that his audience will understand what he means by conscience, especially since he follows, by and large, the writings of the Anglican Bishop Butler, which were common knowledge in early 19th century Oxford. Now, in order to find a detailed account of the phenomenon of conscience, we need to turn first to the Grammar of Assent. Here Newman describes conscience as a voice which speaks within us, yet comes from without. It's so distinctive, he says, that it is like no other dictate in the whole of our experience. It speaks with authority, commanding or forbidding us to do certain things, and judging our actions, expressing approval or disapproval of them to us. So where does this voice come from? Well, Newman will not accept that it is a construction or an invention of our own or of our culture, as some suggested. He does not think that innate ideas of right and wrong have given rise to the idea of an inner voice. No. According to Newman, it's exactly the other way about. Our feelings of approbation or blame, he says, that come to us in connection with our actions, however secret, themselves lead us towards an understanding of what is right and wrong. Our calling certain actions right and wrong actually follows from the feeling of approbation or blame which we experience. Now, Newman carefully demonstrates that this voice has an intimate bearing on our affections and emotions, leading us to reverence and awe, hope and fear. This is crucial to his argument for the origin of conscience, because he explains that a person may experience shame, even disgust, at his own wrongdoing, in a way that could be confused with conscience, as he is explaining it. Taste and moral sense may both give rise to such feelings of disgust and shame at one's own actions. Such reactions can, of course, be cultivated by education and from a sense of one's reputation, or even pride in one's self-control. But what characterizes conscience is the sense of fear and awe which can accompany our actions. He says that no fear is felt by anyone who recognizes that his conduct has not been beautiful, though he may be mortified at himself, if perhaps he has thereby forfeited some advantage. Conscience is fundamentally different from this kind of moral sensibility or good taste, because it presents itself directly as authoritative. To have transgressed that authority, to have ignored that voice, inspires not just self-disgust, but fear. I should say that Newman here mentions not only what he calls haunting remorse and chill dismay at the prospect of the future, as though only negative feelings were associated with conscience, but also their contraries, when the conscience is good, as real, though less forcible, self-approval, inward peace, lightness of heart, and the like. In other words, the phenomena of a good conscience, as well as of a bad one, still lead us to the sense of an inward voice of authority, which sees and judges all that we do, however secret. In this sense, therefore, conscience is a unique and distinctive phenomenon over which we have no control. We do not cause it to come about. We do not influence its commands or judgments upon us. Moreover, it is, as Newman says, altogether unratiocinative, means to do with the processes of thought. It's not something, therefore, that reasons out within us, but speaks directly. Therefore, we must distinguish carefully between our power of reasoning, which is a faculty of our own mind, and the voice of conscience, which is not of our own mind at all. Nor is it merely a phenomenon associated with a certain kind of religious background or upbringing. For Newman insists, it exists among all classes of persons, of whatever origin, race, or religion. Now, he does not say that its particular injunctions are always clear, or that they are always consistent with each other. But what I am insisting on here is that it commands, that it praises, it blames, it promises, it threatens, it implies a future, and it witnesses the unseen. Apropos of that, "Thou, God, seest me," was a phrase from the book of Genesis that Newman himself used on many occasions. The sense of being seen by God at all times would seem to be an effect of the voice of conscience within us. Now, although the existence of this voice is beyond our control, it is nonetheless one that we can choose to ignore. In one of his sermons on various occasions, Newman says that a person may silence it in particular cases or directions. He may distort its enunciations, but he cannot, or it is quite the exception if he cannot quite emancipate himself from it. He can disobey it. He may refuse to use it, but it remains. So there would seem to be some way in which we can not exactly control such a voice from without, from a manifestly superior being, as Newman calls the author of the voice, but certainly adjust ourselves to the way in which we regard its commands, even to the point of becoming effectively deaf to it. In the grammar, he explains this kind of power we ourselves have over the way in which we hear this voice of conscience thus. It's a long quotation. Whatever be the actual history of the first formation of the divine image within us, so far at least is certain, that by informations external to ourselves, as time goes on, it admits of being strengthened and improved. It is certain, too, that whether it grows brighter and stronger, or, on the other hand, is dimmed, distorted, or obliterated, depends on each of us individually and on his circumstances. It is more than probable that in the event, from neglect, from the temptations of life, from bad companions, or from the urgency of secular occupations, the light of the soul will fade away and die out. Men transgress their sense of duty and gradually lose those sentiments of shame and fear which are the witnesses of the unseen judge. That's the end of that quotation. Newman therefore tells us here that in contrast to what he has said earlier about not being able entirely to free ourselves from it, this authoritative voice can be strengthened or even weakened to the point of obliteration. As it is weakened by being ignored, so it is strengthened by being listened to and obeyed. Meanwhile, there is another aspect of conscience which Newman deals with elsewhere at length, which does involve ratiocination and mental judgment. In contrast with the voice of conscience, which is immediate and unratiocinative, he also describes conscience as a mental act. The kind of mental act of which he's thinking, he says, is analogous to memory, reasoning, and imagination. And these mental acts are all, of course, ratiocinative in varying degrees. What makes conscience unlike these other mental acts, however, is precisely its origin outside the person. Even the power to reason, which we describe conscience as possessing, when contemplating the kind of action we should take in particular circumstances, is itself related to the voice of authority that speaks within, yet comes from without. But how can conscience really be both an immediate, unratiocinative voice and at the same time a mode of moral reasoning? Newman shows that it is indeed by pointing to the fact that conscience can be trained precisely as a tool of moral reasoning, as all the other powers of reasoning can be trained. The training of the moral sense, of course, need not be considered the same as the training of conscience. Now, following Aristotle, Newman calls moral reasoning phronesis. A moral sense may be entirely subjective. We've already considered how Newman accepts that a sense of shame and self-disgust may be quite alien to the sense of fear and of having transgressed a command, which is the true mark of conscience. So how does a trained conscience differ from phronesis? To consider how Newman sees this, let's look at his description of how the conscience can go seriously awry. He says, by informations external to ourselves as time goes on, conscience admits of being strengthened and improved. It is certain too that whether it grows brighter and stronger, or on the other hand is dimmed, distorted, or obliterated, depends on each of us individually and on his circumstances. And then the passage which is obviously clearly inspired by the parable of the sower. He says, "It is more than probable that in the event, from neglect, from temptations of life, from bad companions, or from the urgency of secular occupations, the light of the soul will fade away and die out. Men transgress their sense of duty and gradually lose those sentiments of shame and fear which are the witnesses of the unseen judge." This, he explains, is how conscience can be reduced to a mere moral sense. For though it may not entirely disappear, the apprehension of the divine image may dwindle to a mere notion of men's intellect. Whereas, on the contrary, the image of God, if duly cherished, may expand, deepen, and be completed with the growth of their powers, and in the course of life, under the various lessons concerning that same God, one and personal, by means of education, social intercourse, experience, and literature. So here then is where the individual conscience can be developed and trained, especially in conjunction with the inculcation of the sense of God's being. In an exchange of letters on faith and morals with his brother Charles, early in 1825, when Charles had already rejected the sense of God in favour of a more nebulous morality, Newman identified that a moral flaw located in the heart and not in the intellect was capable of skewing a person's sense of God's very existence. This was why he was not convinced of the power of reason alone to bring about a real intellectual assent to the idea of God. He says, "Conscience is a connecting principle between the creature and his creator. When men begin all their works with the thought of God, acting for his sake and to fulfill his will, when they thus ask his blessing on themselves and their life, pray to him for the objects they desire and see them in the event, whether it be according to their prayers or not, they will find everything that happens to them tends to confirm them in the truth about him, which lives in their imagination." Since Newman holds that the personal nature of conscience is crucial to understanding its power, it's not surprising that we find him saying, as we do in the Tamworth Reading Room Letters of 1841, "Persons influence us, voices melt us, looks subdue us, deeds inflame us." It was this awareness of the personal nature of the voice that speaks inwardly that Newman understood was the true explanation of its extraordinary power, and hence the importance for Newman of the role of a teacher in bringing out the power of imagination in strengthening the conscience. Now, Newman's approach to all aspects of teaching was consistently a personal one. It's no surprise that he chose for his cardinalatial motto, "Cor ad cor loquitur," since there could be no better summary of the importance he attached to personal influence. Whether it was a tutor in Oxford, or the rector of the university in Dublin, or as a Sunday school teacher and catechist in Littlemore and Birmingham, or again as the founder and director of the Oratory School, Newman consistently saw his own role as teacher as one who had been placed over his pupils in loco parentis, just as he saw, similarly, parents in their turn to be in loco dei to their children, as he explained in one of his earliest sermons on education. But Newman saw that this kind of teaching required a particular kind of understanding on the part of the teacher. In order to be a good teacher, one who has a good effect on the development of his pupil's whole character and sense of responsibility and purpose, such a teacher must himself have learned what it is to hear and respond to the voice of God and to have formed the image of God within his own soul. As an illustration of this, one of Newman's students, William Lockhart, wrote a memoir of the Cardinal in which he recounts some events which illustrates how he touched the consciences of others entrusted to his pastoral and tutorial care. Lockhart relates that one of the undergraduates at Oriel College was summoned by Newman to see him on account of a misdemeanour of some kind. Afterwards, his friends asked him, "What did Newman say to you?" The young man replied that he couldn't remember, but he said, "He looked at me." Now that look must have struck the young man as being akin to the voice of conscience, judging him, yet also encouraging him to repent and to be good. Now Newman's contribution to the understanding of conscience in relation to the Church's magisterium is to be found above all in the letter to the Duke of Norfolk. It's necessary to explain the context of this work. Now, it so happens that very often in Newman's life, he found himself called upon to address a particular challenge, either to himself personally, as in the case of Kingsley's ad hominem attack, which inspired his Apologia, or as in the case of those like Pusey in his Irenicon, who attacked the Church's teaching on Our Lady and devotion to her. The genesis of the letter to the Duke of Norfolk was an attack by Prime Minister Gladstone, who was a High Church Anglican politician, and was indignant at the definition of papal infallibility made at the First Vatican Council in 1870. Now, the essence of Gladstone's charge was that Catholics were obliged by the dogma of papal infallibility to subject their consciences to the absolute authority of the Pope, with two consequences. First, that they must ever be subject to the total authority over them of a foreign power, which would take precedence over all national law. And secondly, that no Catholic would ever be able to think for himself ever again. Now Newman, as was often the case, recognised the problem Gladstone was raising as being essentially a misunderstanding of what the doctrine of infallibility actually claims for papal authority, and how it does not, or rather cannot, interfere with the moral judgment and commands of conscience in the individual Catholic. Newman considers that Gladstone's difficulty lies deeper than with the papal infallibility. It is a problem with the Church itself. It is the powers of the Church, and not their distribution among the bishops within the body of the Church, that causes Gladstone's unease. This is, of course, a difficulty precisely for a Tractarian Anglican such as Gladstone, who believed, as Newman had once done, that the Anglican Church was Catholic. Newman skewers Gladstone by stating that a triangle is the same in its substance and nature, whichever side is made its base. Or in other words, it's not who bears and wields authority in the Church that is the trouble, but the authority of the Church itself. Now, Gladstone refers to the papal authority as the taking up of what he calls generically rusty tools. But in answer, Newman states that these tools, which he specifies as the Church's right to warn and punish the powerful, to excommunicate stubborn kings, to denounce immoral doctrines, and attack and uproot heresy, were in fact the weapons which civilized Europe. If they're rusty, says Newman, then presumably they're not being used on a daily basis. or else they wouldn't get rusty at all. Therefore, perhaps, Newman suggests ironically, Gladstone wants the tools to be in more frequent use than is presently the case. Well, Gladstone, of course, condemns such tools, but Newman only points out that they belong to the very constitution of the Church, not to the Pope in person. He takes as an example the ecumenical councils of the Church. Since there are relatively few of these, and they can sometimes be many hundreds of years apart, perhaps they too are rusty tools. Yet what do councils do but teach the truth and correct error? Still, Newman is never prepared to paper over difficulties that have been pointed out. And he freely admits that he's far from saying that popes are never in the wrong and are never to be resisted, or that their excommunications always avail. When such actions were taken by popes, for instance in medieval times, when they intervened in quarrels between a prince and his people, such interventions depended for their effectiveness on their reception by the faithful. And as Newman says, in those times, the sentiment of Europe was radically papal. So the power of the Pope depended in such times on the mind and understanding of the people as a whole, and they received what the Pope did accordingly. This brings us yet closer to the heart of the matter of individual conscience and the Pope's authority. Newman restates Gladstone's main point, which is this: that since the Pope claims infallibility in faith and morals, and since there are no departments and functions of human life which do not and cannot fall within the domain of morals, therefore Catholics are moral and mental slaves, and every convert and member of the Pope's Church places his loyalty and civil duty at the mercy of another. In other words, Gladstone asserts that the claim of infallibility implies the claim to an absolute and entire obedience. Yet, as Newman points out, this apparently draconian language and attitude is surely scriptural, since we're commanded in the letter of the Hebrews to obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls. Not only is such authority in the Church prescribed by Scripture, but its motive and purpose in directing and commanding is not one of tyranny over people, but of pastoral concern for their welfare and salvation. Getting down to details, Newman dissects Gladstone's language closely. According to Gladstone, the pontiff declares to belong to him the supreme direction of Catholics in respect to all duty. But Newman says supreme is not minute, nor does direction mean supervision or management. The Pope's authority is not micromanagement of the lives and minds of Catholics. Newman says there's a parallel case with the civil law, which is supreme and directs our conduct, and may and must be absolutely obeyed. But who therefore says that the law has the supreme direction of us? He continues with this important deduction. No one would say that the law, after all, with all its power in the abstract and its executive vigour in fact, interferes either with our comfort or our conscience. However, in parentheses, I would in fact go so far as to say that what was the case in Newman's day may well be different in our own, when there are reasons to suspect that the power of the law to interfere with both comfort and conscience is growing or at least threatening to do so. Yet whatever the relation of the civil law to our individual freedom may now be, or may yet become, the relationship between the Church's authority, as exercised through her magisterium on the one hand, and the individual conscience of the Catholic Christian on the other, has not changed since Newman's time. Has Gladstone perhaps made a point that Newman has missed? Maybe the Pope exercises a role not only as the framer of generic rules and doctrinal teachings, but let's suppose that he functions rather like a medical advisor to a businessman. The businessman may well put his confidence in his doctor, who, being a good and honest man, will say to his patient, if he's in precarious health, "You must not go on a journey today," or "You must take a few days' rest," or "You need to attend to your diet." Yet this, says Newman, is not a fair parallel to the Pope's kind of hold over us. For the Pope, he says, does not speak personally to us, as a doctor does to his patient, but to all, and in speaking definitively on ethical subjects, what he propounds must relate to things good and bad in themselves, in general, not to things accidental, changeable, and of mere expedience. Nonetheless, even the medical man in whom we may put our trust for sound advice, who may therefore be said to give us a supreme direction, cannot be said to interfere with our daily conduct, nor can it be said that we are our doctor's slaves, just because he gives us knowledgeable and sound advice. We're still free to act as we will, even though, if we go against him, it may well be at our own peril. Gladstone wants to make the Pope say that no one can disobey him without risking his salvation. But as Newman more correctly and subtly puts it, what the Pope does say is that no one can disbelieve the duty of obedience and unity without such risk to his salvation. So obedience is not absolute, but obedience for the sake of unity must be believed to be a duty in principle. Newman clarifies the nature of the subordination and obedience owed to the papal authority, quoting the First Vatican Council's Pastor Aeternus, where it is stated that pastors and people are bound by the duty of hierarchical subordination and true obedience, not only in matters which pertain to faith and morals, but also in those which pertain to the discipline and the regimen of the Church spread throughout the world. Nowhere does it say that such obedience is absolute. Furthermore, the matter under this law concerns such matters as the regulation of liturgy and canon law, all designed for the purpose of the good ordering of the body of the Church and for preserving its unity, a unity guaranteed by the Pope. But maybe it is possible in theory for there to be a clash of jurisdictions over people's actions, such that the civil law may be opposed by the canon law. Now, Newman suggests a not entirely hypothetical case. Suppose Parliament were to order all Catholics to attend Protestant service every week, and the Pope ordered all Catholics not to do so, as violating our faith. He, Newman, would in this matter obey the Pope. This is, of course, not entirely hypothetical, since such was actually the case during the penal times in this country. Contrariwise, Newman can see the possibility, though in this case definitely hypothetical, that he would disobey the Pope and obey the civil law as a matter of conscience. For instance, were he a soldier and sent to fight in a war he considered in conscience to be just, and were the Pope to bid all Catholics to withdraw immediately from the army, he would, but only after taking advice as best he could from others, not obey the Pope. He moves on to more specific cases, such as those envisaged by Cardinal Bellarmine, who said that as it is lawful to resist the Pope if he assaulted a man's person, so it is lawful to resist him if he assaulted souls or troubled the state, and much more if he strove to destroy the Church. It's lawful, Bellarmine says, to resist him by not doing what he commands and hindering the execution of his will. Thus, even the great Tridentine Jesuit theologian saw clearly that the Pope's authority could not be in any sense absolute. So, when Gladstone asks how Catholics can obey both the Pope and the Queen, Newman replies that it is his rule to obey both. But if one claimed an absolute obedience over him, then the Pope or the Queen would be transgressing the laws of human society. In such a hypothetical case, Newman says that he would consult as widely and well as he could theologians, bishops, clergy, his confessor, and friends whom he revered. But if after all I could not take their view of the matter, then I must rule myself by my own judgment and my own conscience. So, what then is the nature of this conscience, such that Newman knows he must rely on it in the last analysis, even should this bring him into conflict with any authority to which he recognized he owed obedience? Well, it's utterly far from self-will and self-determination, for it is to be identified with what St. Augustine calls the eternal law, the divine reason of the will of God, which commands the observance and forbids the disturbance of the natural order of things. This law, apprehended in the minds of individual men, is called conscience. And although it may suffer what he calls refraction in passing into the intellectual medium of each individual person, it's not thereby so affected as to lose its divine character, but has the prerogative of commanding obedience. Thus, the supreme rule within us of our actions is the divine law, and this divine law is the rule of our conduct by means of our conscience. Hence, it's never lawful to go against conscience, precisely insofar as it is none other than the voice of God, and not the product of our own thoughts and reasonings. Newman emphasizes this understanding of conscience as a messenger from him who both in nature and in grace speaks to us behind a veil and rules us and teaches us by his representatives. And he continues with one of his most arresting images, defining conscience as the aboriginal vicar of Christ, a prophet in its informations. Conscience is a principle planted within us before we have any training, although training and experience are necessary for its growth, its strength, and due formation, as we've already considered. Once again, as we've also already heard, such an understanding of conscience shows how it is the internal witness both of the existence of God and of his law. Certainly Newman, following the teaching of Bishop Butler, believes that conscience is a far surer guide to our acceptance of God's existence than reason alone. exactly because it is a voice which, although it speaks within us, has its origins outside us. And therefore we ask ourselves, whence does such a voice come, if not from God? Far from seeing conscience as in some way set in opposition to the Pope's authority, even in the last resort, Newman sees that the Pope's authority actually depends upon conscience, both for its power and for its acceptance. So when Pope Gregory XVI condemns liberty of conscience, he does not mean by that the right and duty of following that divine authority, the voice of conscience, on which in truth the Church herself is built. For if the Pope were to speak thus and condemn conscience per se, he would, says Newman, commit a suicidal act. He would be cutting the ground from under his feet. For, and again this is Newman, on the law of conscience and its sacredness are founded both the Pope's authority in theory and his power in fact. Here Newman reminds us that science and religion, though both of them are kinds of knowledge, are quite different in their mode of certainty. Sciences have their certainty in themselves. That is, the power of reason can demonstrate this or that rule, which is identified through experimentation. But the first element in religion is not this kind of reasoning, but as Newman says, it is the sense of right and wrong. And this sense is so easily puzzled, obscured, perverted, so subtle in its argumentative methods, so impressible by education, so biased by pride and passion, so unsteady in its course, that in the struggle for existence amid the various exercises and triumphs of the human intellect, this sense is at once the highest of all teachers, yet the least luminous. And the Church, the Pope, the hierarchy are in the divine purpose the supply of an urgent demand to clarify what conscience may not necessarily make clear. Therefore, conscience presupposes the need of an infallible guide. But the infallible guide is not infallible in everything that he does or says, nor does the Church claim anything of the kind. But quite as far from Newman's mind as such a tyranny would be if it existed in the Church, is the opposite view that places conscience above even infallible teaching. The individual is obliged to put aside self-will and not to place it on a pedestal as though it were an infallible authority in its own right. Yes, conscience must be obeyed, but only when it is accepted as God's voice and not our own. And that can only be certain, if then, when it has been assisted by the Church's clarifying teaching, and by the act of consulting those whom God has given to enlighten and guide the judgment of conscience. Thus, Newman says that unless a man is able to say to himself, as in the presence of God, that he must not and dare not act upon a papal injunction, he is bound to obey it and would commit a great sin by disobeying it. Prima facie, it is his bounden duty, even from a sentiment of loyalty, to believe the Pope right and act accordingly. So from this it can be seen how right Newman is to say that although it is a voice of command, the voice of conscience is not itself always clear. A conscience must be obeyed insofar as it is understood sincerely to be God's voice and not mere self-will, self-justification. But for that reason also it needs guidance and formation, for that surety to be as far as possible known. It's out of respect for the divine origin of conscience, and nothing less, that Newman would drink to the Pope, if you please, still to conscience first, and to the Pope afterwards. Thank you very much.